You have just given away the biggest ox in the district. You searched for weeks to find it. It is fat, it is enormous, and you hauled it across the desert as a Christmas gift for the people who have fed you and put up with your endless questions. Now everyone in camp is walking around it and shaking their heads. A bag of bones, they tell you. Skin and ribs. Somebody suggests you may have to boil the horns and drink the broth because there is clearly nothing on this animal worth eating. This really happened. In December of 1969, an anthropologist named Richard Lee published an account of that Christmas in a magazine called Natural History. Lee had been doing field work in the Dobe area of the Kalahari in what is now Botswana, among a foraging people often called the Kung. He was confused and a little hurt by the reaction to his ox, so he asked a man named Tomaso to explain it. What Tomaso told him is one of the most important things anyone has ever written down about human power. The insults were deliberate. Everyone could see the ox was fat. Everyone knew they were about to eat well for days. But when a young man brings in a lot of meat, Tomaso said, he begins to think of himself as a big man, and he begins to think of everyone else as his servants. One day that pride will push him to kill somebody. So the camp calls his meat worthless. It cools his heart. It makes him gentle again. Sit with that for a moment. Does that sound like rudeness to you? Those people were operating a machine, and the machine had one job. The machine existed to stop kings from happening. An anthropologist at the University of Southern California named Christopher Boehm spent years working through ethnographies, which are the long, detailed field reports anthropologists write about the societies they live in. He was hunting for exactly this pattern. In 1999, he published a book called Hierarchy in the Forest, and his conclusion was blunt. Foraging bands do not drift into equality on their own. The group works at it, constantly, and the work is aimed at one specific target: anybody who starts behaving like a chief. Boehm gave the arrangement a name: a reverse dominance hierarchy. In a chimpanzee troop, the strongest male dominates everyone beneath him. In a human foraging band, the arrangement flips over. The rank and file, acting together, dominates the strongest man. And they have a whole toolkit for doing it. They mock him, they ignore his instructions, they quietly pack up and walk to another camp, taking their labor with them. And in the rare, ugly cases, when a man cannot be shamed and cannot be ignored, the group kills him. Now ask yourself what all four of those tools have in common. Every one of them depends on something you have probably never had to think about. They all depend on being able to leave. You should know that this evidence is argued over. Some anthropologists say the Kalahari groups Lee worked with were never sealed off from herders and traders, and that reading them as a window into the deep past gets the history backwards. That argument has been running for decades. But the leveling behavior itself has been recorded in forager societies scattered across 4 continents by researchers who agree about almost nothing else. So the deep past is where you have to look next. Roughly 34,000 years ago, on the cold plain near what is now the Russian city of Vladimir, someone dug a long, narrow grave. The site is called Sungir, and it was excavated over 2 decades by a Russian archaeologist named Otto Bader, beginning in the 1950s. Inside that grave were 2 children, around 10 and 12 years old, laid head to head, and buried with them were more than 10,000 beads carved from mammoth ivory, along with 20 ivory armbands, 300 pierced fox teeth, carved artwork, deer antlers, and 16 spears made of straightened mammoth tusk, the longest of which runs nearly 2.5 meters. 10,000 beads, each one cut, shaped, and drilled by hand, by people with no metal. How many winter evenings does that take? In a nearby grave lay a man of about 40, healthy, strong, an obvious asset to any hunting group. He was buried with roughly 3,000 beads. The children got more than 3 times what the adult got. And a 10-year-old has achieved nothing yet. A 10-year-old has never killed a mammoth or fed a camp. Whatever those children were given, it was not payment for work they had done. Does that mean the Ice Age had aristocrats? Honestly, nobody knows. It might be inherited rank, passed down in families that had already started to think of themselves as different. It might be grief. It might be that both children died in a way the community found so disturbing that they buried the problem under a mountain of ivory, and archaeologists have argued for every one of those readings. What the grave does tell you is that 34,000 years ago, somebody had already worked out how to make a claim about status that outlives the person making it. Now jump forward to a beach on the Black Sea. In October of 1972, a 22-year-old excavator operator named Rachel Marinov was digging a cable trench in the industrial zone west of Varna in Bulgaria, and his machine turned up some odd metal objects. He collected them, put them in a shoebox, and took them home. A few days later, he thought better of it and called the museum. He had cut into the richest burial ground of its age anywhere on Earth. Bulgarian archaeologists, working under Mikhail Lazarov and later Ivan Ivanov, spent 19 years excavating almost 300 graves dating from roughly 4600 to 4200 BCE. Together, those graves held around 3,000 gold objects. And then there is Grave 43. Grave 43 holds one adult man buried with nearly 1,000 separate pieces of gold, about 1.5 kilos of it worked into bracelets and a breastplate and laid in pieces across his body. That single grave contained more gold than had been found in the entire rest of the world for that period. This is 1,000 years before the pyramids, before writing, before anything you would call a kingdom. Who was he? Nobody can tell you his name. But look at how the gold is distributed. It is not spread evenly across those 300 graves. It clusters in a handful of them. Whatever the mourners meant by that, they were writing a difference between people into the ground, in a material that does not rot, in a form meant to be permanent. A forager camp has no way to write that difference. There is nothing to write it in. What broke? Between the Kalahari camp and Grave 43, something changed, and the simplest way to describe it is that walking away stopped being an option. Think about what leveling actually requires. If your neighbor becomes unbearable, you leave. That threat is your whole political system. It works because your wealth is your skills and your relationships, and both of those travel with you. Now put grain in a pit, put a herd in a pen, put a wall around a field your grandmother cleared. Once your food supply is a fixed object sitting in a place, leaving it behind means starving, which means the man who controls the pit and the pen and the wall can absorb an insult that would have destroyed a hunter, shrug at your disapproval, and go right on doing whatever he was doing, because your disapproval no longer costs him anything. Suddenly, he has something no forager ever had. He has the ability to make leaving expensive. An anthropologist named Robert Carnero pushed that idea to its hardest edge in a paper published in the journal Science in 1970, called A Theory of the Origin of the State. Carnero noticed that the earliest states appear in places that are hemmed in. River valleys with desert on both sides. Coastal strips backed by mountains. In open country, the losers of a war just leave and start over somewhere else. In circumscribed country, the losers have nowhere to go, so they submit and pay and become subjects. That argument is not settled, and you should know it before you repeat it. Critics point out that it assumes every village wanted to conquer its neighbors in the first place, and a cross-cultural reanalysis published in 2016 found the pattern holds in some regions and falls apart in others. Egypt fits it well. Plenty of other places do not. But the critics and Carnero agree on the part that matters here. Permanent power over other people needs those people to be stuck. Which brings you to the word itself. The first men in history who are unmistakably kings show up in Mesopotamia, in the Sumerian city-states, and the Sumerian word for a king is lugal. It is written with two signs. Lu means man, gal means big. Big man. Their word for king is the exact insult the Kalahari camp existed to prevent. How does a warning turn into a job title? Scholars still argue about how Lugal related to the other Sumerian ruler titles, En and Ensi, and about which came first. But nobody argues about the etymology. Somewhere in the 4th millennium BCE, the big man stopped being the problem and became the office. Nobody voted for this. There was no moment when humanity decided to have kings. The capacity was always there, sitting in the same primate hardware that gives chimpanzees their alpha males, held down for tens of thousands of years by ridicule and by the constant low-grade work of taking powerful men down a peg. Kingship is what happens when that suppression fails. And it fails wherever you cannot leave. Which is worth thinking about the next time you sit in a meeting and watch everyone laugh a little too hard at something the boss said that was not funny. What is that laugh actually doing? It is a status signal, and your ancestors used the opposite version of it for thousands of generations. They laughed at power, not with it. Ridicule was the technology, exit was the enforcement. Ask yourself how easy it would be to walk away from your job, your landlord, your city, your country. Ask what it would cost you. That cost is not really an economic figure at all. Every kingdom in history has been built on top of it. You are sitting by a fire, and someone walks in carrying far more than anyone else. Everything depends on whether the rest of you still feel free to laugh.